Welcome to Facts Radio, your journey through history begins here. In this episode, we explore Christmas, a global phenomenon that transcends borders, languages, and beliefs, yet whose origins are buried beneath layers of snow, ash, and time. We often think of this holiday as a static picture postcard, a quiet manger scene or a Victorian living room filled with laughter, but the true story is a turbulent river of history that flows from the terrified prayers of Neolithic farmers to the raucous banquets of imperial Rome. To understand Christmas, we must strip away the commercial gloss and the synchronized lights of the modern city to find the primal spark that ignited the darkness of the ancient world. This is not just a story of religion, it is the story of humanity's desperate, beautiful, and enduring battle against the winter night. Chapter 1: The Fear of the Dying Sun. Imagine standing on a windswept hill in northern Europe, 5,000 years ago, as the biting wind cuts through your furs and the sun dips below the horizon at mid-afternoon. This was the reality for our Neolithic ancestors, for whom winter was not merely a season of inconvenience, but a terrifying existential threat that brought starvation and death to their doorsteps. As the days grew shorter and the shadows lengthened, a palpable dread settled over these early communities, born from the very real fear that the sun, the giver of all life, might eventually sink into the earth and never return. It is hard for us, bathed in electric light, to truly grasp the absolute, crushing darkness that defined the ancient winter, a darkness that was filled with unseen predators and the creeping chill of the grave. To combat this encroaching night, humanity built monuments of stone and earth, vast calendars engineered to capture the fleeting light and reassure the people that the cycle would indeed continue. At sites like Newgrange in Ireland and Stonehenge in England, the architecture itself was a desperate prayer, perfectly aligned to capture the first rays of the sun on the winter solstice. These were not mere temples, they were survival mechanisms, communal gathering points where people would huddle together to witness the miracle of the sun standing still before beginning its slow, triumphant ascent back into the sky. The winter solstice, usually falling around December 21st, marked the pivotal turning point of the year, a moment of profound psychological relief that demanded celebration. The celebration of the solstice was driven by necessity and biology as much as spirituality, for this was the only time of year when fresh meat was abundant. Facing the impossibility of feeding all their livestock through the barren winter months, ancient farmers slaughtered the majority of their cattle, creating a sudden surplus of food that had to be consumed quickly. This pragmatic agricultural cycle dictated the rhythm of the feast, turning a time of scarcity into a brief, glorious explosion of gluttony and warmth. The air would have been thick with the smoke of roasting meat and the fermentation of wine and ale, which had finally finished brewing just in time for the deep freeze. Fire played a central role in these solstice rituals, serving as a sympathetic magic intended to fuel the weakening sun and drive back the encroaching shadows. Immense bonfires were lit on hilltops, their flames leaping into the black sky as a defiant signal that life remained unbroken despite the frost. These fires were communal hearths, places where stories were told and bonds were forged, creating a sense of unity that was essential for surviving the months of isolation that lay ahead. It is fascinating to consider that the twinkling lights we string upon our modern houses are the direct descendants of these ancient, roaring blazes. The psychological impact of the solstice cannot be overstated. It was the moment when the psychological burden of winter began to lift, replaced by the promise of spring's eventual return. In the depths of the longest night, the ancients found a reason to hope, anchoring their survival to the predictable movements of the cosmos. This connection between the darkest time of the year and the birth of light is the foundational bedrock upon which all later midwinter festivals were built. The specific deities would change, and the rituals would evolve, but the core human need to gather against the dark remained constant. Even today, when we light a candle in a dark room or gather around a fireplace, we are participating in a ritual that stretches back to the very dawn of human consciousness. We are acknowledging the fragility of our existence and the comfort of shared warmth, just as those Neolithic farmers did millennia ago. The fear of the dying sun has been forgotten, replaced by the calendar and the clock, but the instinct to celebrate the return of the light remains hardwired into our DNA. Chapter 2: Saturnalia and the Roman Chaos. As civilization marched forward and the rough settlements of the Stone Age gave way to the marble splendor of Rome, the midwinter celebration underwent a dramatic transformation. In the heart of the empire, the orderly discipline of Roman life was temporarily suspended for Saturnalia, a raucous festival honoring Saturn, the god of agriculture and time. Beginning on December 17 and lasting for a week, the courts were closed, wars were paused, and the strict social hierarchy that defined Roman existence was turned completely on its head. It was a world turned upside down, a licensed period of anarchy where the rigid rules of the state were dissolved in a sea of wine and revelry. Imagine the cacophony of the Roman streets during this week, the shouts of Io Saturnalia, echoing off the stone walls, the smell of spiced wine, and the sight of citizens clad not in their formal white togas, but in the synthesis, a colorful, informal garment usually forbidden in public. The atmosphere was electric with a sense of liberation, as the suffocating norms of dignity and decorum were cast aside in favor of unbridled hedonism. Gambling, usually illegal, was played openly in the streets, with dice rattling on tavern tables as fortunes were won and lost amidst uproarious laughter. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of Saturnalia to the modern observer would be the reversal of roles between the enslaved and the free. For these few days, masters would serve their slaves at the banquet table, waiting on them as they ate, or perhaps they would all dine together as equals. While this was a temporary pressure valve rather than a genuine call for social reform, it provided a powerful psychological release, suggesting that under the gaze of the ancient gods, all men shared a common humanity. It is strange to think that this tradition of social inversion survives today in the British military tradition of officers serving Christmas dinner to the enlisted ranks. Gift-giving, a central pillar of our modern Christmas, found its vigorous roots in the Roman tradition of the Sigillaria, the final days of the festival dedicated to exchanging tokens of affection. Citizens exchanged wax candles, known as cirae, which signified the returning light of the sun, and small terracotta figurines that were often given to children. The wealthy might exchange silver or gold, while the poor gave simple tokens, but the spirit of generosity was universal, binding the community together in a web of reciprocal obligation and goodwill. Martial, the Roman poet, vividly catalogued these gifts in his writings, listing everything from toothpicks and warm togas to exotic animals and writing tablets. The noise of Saturnalia was legendary, a deafening roar of parties, music, and shouting that made sleep nearly impossible for those few who preferred quiet. Pliny the Younger, a wealthy lawyer and author, famously built a soundproof room in his villa just so he could work without being disturbed by the shouts of his own household celebrating the holiday. This tension between the desire for peace and the demand for celebration is a dynamic that remains familiar to anyone who has navigated a bustling family gathering today. The Romans understood that to survive the darkness of winter, one had to embrace the chaos of life, filling the void with noise, light, and connection. Yet, beneath the drunkenness and the gambling, there was a profound religious undercurrent, a recognition that the golden age of Saturn, a mythical time of abundance and peace, could be briefly recreated on Earth. The statue of Saturn in the Roman Forum, whose feet were normally bound in wool to symbolize the containment of his chaotic power, was untied during the festival, allowing his influence to saturate the city. It was a time when the iron grip of reality was loosened, allowing people to dream of a world without hunger, toil, or servitude. As the Roman Empire expanded, so too did the influence of Saturnalia, spreading its traditions of greenery, lights, and feasting to the farthest corners of the known world. These customs became so deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric of Europe that they could not be easily uprooted, even as new religions began to take hold. The echoes of those Roman shouts, the dice games, and the candlelit banquets still resonate in the way we celebrate, proving that the need for midwinter joy is a universal human legacy. Chapter 3: Yule and the Nordic Chill. Far to the north of the Roman vineyards, beyond the boundaries of the empire, the Germanic and Norse people celebrated their own midwinter festival, a rugged and mysterious observance known as Yule. Here, in the dense, snow-choked forests of Scandinavia, the winter was not merely a season but a brutal test of endurance, and the darkness was absolute. Yule, or Jol, was not a time of chaotic street parties, but a deeply spiritual communion with the forces of nature and the spirits of the dead who were believed to wander the earth during the long nights. It is chilling to imagine the Norse families huddled in their longhouses, listening to the wind howl through the pines, believing it to be the sound of the wild hunt thundering across the sky. The wild hunt was a terrifying procession of ghostly apparitions and spectral hounds, led by the one-eyed god Odin, who rode his eight-legged horse, Sleipnir, through the turbulent winter storms. To the Norse, Odin was the father of Yule, a wandering deity who would visit homes in disguise, rewarding the hospitable and punishing the wary. This image of a bearded, white-haired figure riding through the night sky to visit households bears a striking, undeniable resemblance to the Santa Claus mythos that would emerge centuries later. The people would leave out food and drink for Odin's horse, hoping to earn the god's favor and protection against the biting frost that threatened their livestock. Central to the Yule celebration was the Yule log, a massive timber, often a whole tree, that was dragged into the communal hall with great ceremony and effort. This was no ordinary fire. The log was chosen with care and set ablaze to burn for the entire duration of the festival, sometimes lasting for 12 days. The burning of the log was a magical act, a piece of the sun brought indoors to conquer the dark, and its ashes were believed to hold protective powers, often spread over the fields to ensure a bountiful harvest in the coming year. The warmth of the Yule log was the beating heart of the community, a circle of light where sagas were told, mead was drunk, and the bonds of kinship were reinforced against the hostile cold. The evergreen tree also held a sacred place in the Germanic imagination, serving as a potent symbol of life's persistence in the face of universal death. While the oaks and maples stood bare and skeletal, looking like the dead themselves, the fir and the pine remained vibrantly green, a miracle that suggested they possessed a special magic. Decorating these trees with food, runes, and carvings was a way to honor the spirits of the forest and to bring the vitality of the natural world into the domestic sphere. It is a profound continuity that we still drag dying trees into our living rooms today, adorning them with lights and glass, reenacting this ancient pagan veneration of the evergreen. The feasting during Yule was legendary, centered around the sacrifice of the Yule boar, an animal sacred to the god Freya, who governed fertility and prosperity. The boar was sworn upon, men would lay their hands on its bristles and make solemn oaths for the coming year, before it was roasted and consumed by the gathered clan. This tradition of the Christmas ham is a direct culinary survivor of these Norse sacrifices, a tasty relic of a time when the dinner table was an altar. The sheer consumption of meat and alcohol during Yule was a defiance of the winter, a bold statement that humanity would not just survive the cold, but would feast in its face. Violence and beauty mingled freely in the Nordic Yule. It was a festival of blood sacrifice and poetry, of drunken revelry and solemn oaths. The harsh environment demanded a harsh celebration, one that acknowledged the proximity of death while fiercely celebrating the continuity of the clan. As the Vikings expanded their reach, raiding and trading across Europe, they brought these Yule traditions with them, planting the seeds of the log, the tree, and the midnight rider in the soil of Britain and beyond. When the gentle narratives of the Mediterranean eventually collided with these rugged northern customs, the result was a complex fusion that would define the future of the holiday. The introspection of the South met the wild magic of the North, creating a tension between the sacred and the savage that still vibrates within our modern Christmas. We can still feel the breath of the north wind and the shadow of Odin every time we hear a story of a sleigh in the sky or smell the scent of pine needles indoors. Chapter 4 of the Nativity, a light in the east. While Rome reveled and the north burned its logs, a quiet, obscure event was unfolding in the dust of the Judean hills that would eventually rewrite the history of the world. The story of the Nativity, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, stands in stark contrast to the noisy pageantry of Saturnalia and the fierce magic of Yule. It is a narrative of humility and displacement, a young couple, Mary and Joseph, forced by an imperial census to travel to the small town of Bethlehem, a journey made arduous by pregnancy and the rough terrain. The Roman world was a place of bureaucracy and power, and this census was a flexing of imperial muscle, a demand that every subject be counted and taxed, setting the stage for a collision between earthly power and spiritual revolution. The traditional image of the stable is one of serene silence, but the historical reality was likely far more chaotic, crowded, and desperate. Bethlehem would have been teeming with travelers, the air filled with the noise of animals and the complaints of the displaced, with no room in the formal guest chambers for the weary couple. The birth likely took place in a lower level of a house where animals were kept for warmth, a setting of dirt, straw, and the pungent smell of livestock. In this lowly environment, stripped of all royal pretense, the central figure of Christianity entered the world, not as a conquering warrior, but as a vulnerable infant. The theological implications of this moment marked a radical departure from the pantheons of the ancient world. This was not a god of thunder or a god of harvest, but a god of the marginalized and the poor. The appearance of the angels to the shepherds, men who resided on the lowest rung of the social ladder, considered unclean and untrustworthy, signaled that this new faith would bypass the powerful to speak directly to the humble. The Star of Bethlehem, which guided the Magi from the east, served as a cosmic endorsement of this event, linking the movements of the heavens to the birth of a child in a way that resonated with the astrological obsession of the era. Historically, however, the Bible offers no specific date for this birth. The text mentions shepherds watching their flocks by night, a practice that typically occurred in the spring or autumn, not the depths of winter. The early church did not initially celebrate the birth of Christ, focusing instead on his death and resurrection as the pivotal moments of the faith. For the first few centuries of Christianity, the idea of a birthday party for the Messiah was viewed with suspicion, seen as a pagan custom ill-suited for the divine. It was not until the 4th century that the Church, growing in power and political savvy, moved to formally assign a date to the Nativity. Pope Julius I is often credited with selecting December 25, a strategic masterstroke that aligned the birth of the Son of God with the birth of the Sun God, specifically the festival of Sol Invictus. By placing Christmas directly on top of the existing pagan celebrations of Saturnalia and the solstice, the Church offered a spiritual alternative that allowed the people to keep their midwinter festivals while redirecting their worship. This synthesis was not a surrender, but a transformation. The light of the bonfires became the light of Christ, and the hope for the returning sun became the hope for salvation. It allowed the new religion to graft itself onto the ancient rootstock of human tradition, ensuring its survival and rapid spread across the continent. The chaos of the Roman holiday was slowly tamed, filtered through a lens of piety, though the rowdy DNA of the older festivals would never be completely suppressed. Thus, the Nativity became the anchor for the holiday, providing a theological justification for the joy, the light, and the gathering that humanity had craved for millennia. It introduced a narrative of compassion and miracles that softened the edges of the winter celebration, adding a layer of moral introspection to the feasting. As we move forward in history, we will see how this fragile story of a child in a manger survived the collapse of empires to become the centerpiece of the Western calendar. Chapter 5: The Lord of Misrule and the Medieval Riot. As the Roman Empire crumbled and the fragmented kingdoms of the Middle Ages rose from the ashes, Christmas did not vanish. Instead, it mutated into a boisterous, often dangerous explosion of pent-up energy. In the great feudal halls of England and France, the holiday was far from the silent, holy night we picture today. It was a 12-day marathon of excess that bordered on authorized chaos. The strict social hierarchy of the medieval world, usually rigid as iron, was temporarily dissolved under the supervision of a figure known as the Lord of Misrule. This elected leader, often a peasant or a subdeacon, was granted mock authority to preside over the festivities, commanding lords and ladies to engage in absurd acts and drunken revelry. It was a direct cultural descendant of the Roman Saturnalia, a necessary pressure valve for a society crushed under the weight of famine, plague, and feudal obligation. The sensory experience of a medieval Christmas was overwhelming, a kaleidoscope of fire, meat, and noise set against the backdrop of a frozen, silent landscape. The tables groaned under the weight of the boar's head, carried into the hall on a gold or silver platter to the sound of trumpets, its mouth stuffed with an apple to symbolize the harvest. The poor, who spent most of the year subsisting on pottage and bread, were often granted entry to the manor for a brief taste of warmth and ale, creating a rare moment of communal unity between the serf and the sovereign. Yet, outside the castle walls, bands of mummers, masked actors performing folk plays, roamed the villages, their faces blackened with soot or hidden behind animal visages. These performances were rowdy and sometimes violent, a mix of pagan superstition and Christian storytelling that hinted at the untamed darkness still lurking at the edges of the faith. Music during this era was not the polite caroling of the Victorian parlor, but a raucous, rhythmic affair designed to drive away the winter chill through sheer volume. The practice of wassailing emerged during these centuries, where groups of peasants would travel from door to door, or even to the orchards to sing to the apple trees, offering a drink from the wassail bowl in exchange for gifts or food. There was an aggressive edge to this tradition. The songs often contained veiled threats of mischief if the master of the house proved stingy with his charity. Imagine the tension of a wealthy merchant opening his door to a crowd of intoxicated, masked strangers demanding entry and drink in the name of the holiday. It was a time when the boundaries of polite society were porous, and the spirit of charity was often enforced by the mob. The Church, while officially celebrating the Nativity, often found itself at war with the very festivities it had sanctioned. Priests railed against the gambling, the gluttony, and the sexual licentiousness that seemed to explode during the 12 days, seeing them as a slide back into heathenism. In some cathedral towns, a boy bishop was elected from the choir to parody the actual bishop, performing mock services that mocked the solemnity of the High Mass. This tension between the sacred altar and the profane street party defined the medieval Christmas, a dual nature that the holiday has never fully shaken off. It was a season where the fear of the winter was drowned out by the roar of the banquet, proving once again that humans will seize any excuse to rage against the dying of the light. Chapter 6: The Puritan Silence, A World Without Christmas. By the mid-17th century, the pendulum of history swung violently in the opposite direction, driven by a new breed of religious zealots who viewed the medieval excesses not as joy, but as sin. In England, the rise of the Puritans and the ascendancy of Oliver Cromwell brought about one of the most shocking cultural cancellations in history, the illegalization of Christmas. To the Puritan mind, there was no biblical authority for the December 25th date, and the holiday's trappings, the feasting, the Yule logs, the mummers, were seen as popish inventions and pagan contamination. In 1644, the Long Parliament officially banned the festival, ordering that December 25th be kept as a day of fasting and humble penance, stripping the calendar of its brightest red letter. Imagine walking through the streets of London on Christmas morning in 1647, where one would expect the smell of roasting goose and the ringing of bells. There was only the grey silence of a standard workday. Town criers walked the cobblestones shouting, "No Christmas! No Christmas!" and soldiers patrolled the markets to ensure shops remained open and no special breads or meats were being sold. Churches were locked up tight to prevent unauthorized services, and ministers who dared to preach on the Nativity risked imprisonment. The psychological shock to the populace was immense. The government had not just banned a party, they had torn a hole in the rhythmic fabric of the year, denying the people their ancestral right to midwinter comfort. This war on Christmas was not accepted quietly. It sparked riots in the streets of Canterbury and Norwich, where defiant citizens brawled with the mayor's troops, protecting their right to play football and drink ale. These plum-pudding riots were a visceral reaction to the state's intrusion into the private joys of the common man, a bloody defense of tradition against ideology. The people decorated their homes in secret, whispering the old carols behind shuttered windows, keeping the ember of the holiday alive in the hearts of the underground. It is hard to believe, but for nearly 2 decades, Christmas was a symbol of political rebellion, a dangerous act of defiance against the grim authority of the Protectorate. The anti-Christmas sentiment crossed the Atlantic with the Pilgrims, taking deep root in the rocky soil of New England. In Boston, the ban was even more severe. A law enacted in 1659 imposed a fine of 5 shillings, a significant sum, on anyone caught observing any such day as Christmas or the like. For generations of early Americans, December 25th was just another day of hard labor, devoid of gifts, trees, or rest. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Christmas became a recognized holiday in New England, a testament to how deeply the Puritan suspicion of the festival had penetrated the American psyche. The ghost of this prohibition still lingers in the debates over the commercialization of the holiday, a distant echo of the time when the pious believed that joy itself was suspect. Chapter 7: The Victorian Reinvention. As the smoke of the Industrial Revolution began to choke the skies of 19th-century Britain, Christmas lay dormant, a dying relic of a rural past that seemed irrelevant in the age of the machine. It was the Victorians who rescued the holiday from oblivion, reinventing it not as a raucous public carnival, but as a private, domestic sanctuary focused on the family and the child. The chief architect of this transformation was Charles Dickens, whose 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol, hit the English-speaking world with the force of a revelation. Dickens did not merely tell a ghost story, he constructed a moral philosophy of Christmas, linking the holiday inextricably with charity, redemption, and the plight of the poor. When we read of Ebenezer Scrooge today, we see a caricature, but to the Victorians, he was a mirror reflecting the cold, Malthusian economic theories that dominated the era. Dickens weaponized the holiday against the cruelty of industrial capitalism, suggesting that the Christmas spirit was a necessary corrective to the greed of the marketplace. The instant success of the book unleashed a wave of Christmas philanthropy, with factory owners giving turkeys to their workers and the wealthy feeling a sudden, fashionable obligation to care for the destitute. Dickens effectively rebranded Christmas from a time of drinking to a time of keeping, a state of mind that required kindness and benevolence toward one's fellow man. Simultaneously, a visual revolution was taking place within the royal palaces that would change the look of the holiday forever. In 1848, the Illustrated London News published an engraving of Queen Victoria and her German husband, Prince Albert, standing with their children around a decorated evergreen tree at Windsor Castle. The image went viral in a way only the 19th century could manage. Suddenly, every middle-class family in England and America needed a Christmas tree in their parlor. Albert had brought the tradition from his childhood in Germany, but by stamping it with the royal seal of approval, he transformed a quirky folk custom into the central icon of the Western winter. The Victorians also invented the family Christmas, withdrawing the celebration from the street and the tavern into the privacy of the home. They revived the old carols, cleaned up the lyrics for polite society, and invented new traditions like the Christmas cracker and the sending of Christmas cards. The chaotic, dangerous energies of the medieval solstice were tamed and domesticated, replaced by a sentimental, candlelit tableau of children opening gifts by the fire. This is the Christmas we recognize today, a constructed nostalgia that feels ancient, yet was largely assembled by a generation desperate to find warmth in a rapidly modernizing world. Chapter 8 of The Rise of the Red Saint. While the Victorians were polishing the sentiment of the season, a new figure was rising in the American imagination, a hybrid entity cobbled together from history, folklore, and commerce, Santa Claus. The journey of this character begins with Saint Nicholas of Myra, a 4th-century Greek bishop known for his secret gift-giving and protection of children, whose legend traveled to the New World with Dutch settlers as Sinterklaas. But the Sinterklaas of the Dutch was a stern, tall bishop in canonical robes, a far cry from the jelly-bellied elf of modern fame. The transformation began in New York, the melting pot where the rough edges of the old world traditions were sanded down into something uniquely American. The turning point came in 1823 with the anonymous publication of the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, commonly known today as The Night Before Christmas, largely attributed to Clement Clarke Moore. In just a few stanzas, Moore rewrote the mythology of the gift-bringer. He stripped away the religious vestments, gave him a sleigh driven by 8 reindeer, and shrank him into a right jolly old elf who entered through the chimney. This was a masterstroke of myth-making. It democratized the saint, removing him from the church and placing him squarely in the realm of childhood magic. Moore's Saint Nick was non-threatening, magical, and, crucially, he brought toys, aligning the holiday with the emerging consumer economy. The visual identity of Santa Claus was solidified later in the century by the political cartoonist Thomas Nast, who drew for Harper's Weekly. During the dark days of the American Civil War, Nast drew Santa visiting Union troops, depicting him as a rotund, bearded figure clad in stars and stripes, and later, in the iconic red suit. Nast gave Santa a home at the North Pole, a place that was politically neutral and universally accessible, and established the idea that he had a workshop of elves. It is fascinating to realize that our image of Santa was sharpened as a piece of wartime propaganda, a symbol of plenty and comfort in a time of national fracture. The final evolution of Santa Claus occurred in the 20th century, driven not by poets or artists, but by the advertising executives of the Coca-Cola Company. In the 1930s, illustrator Haddon Sundblom created a series of ads featuring a Santa who was larger than life, with a face glowing with health and a suit of vibrant, brand-aligned red. Sundblom's Santa was not an elf, but a human-sized grandfather figure, radiating warmth and approachability, solidifying the image that is now recognized from Tokyo to Rio. This progression from a skeletal saint to a corporate icon mirrors the trajectory of Christmas itself, a sacred origin wrapped in layers of secular storytelling until it became a universal cultural currency. Chapter 9, The Truce of 1914, A Silence in the Mud. In the annals of Christmas history, there is one moment that stands apart, a moment where the raw power of the holiday transcended the most brutal machinery of death humanity had ever constructed. It was December 1914, 5 months into the First World War, and the Western Front was a frozen scar of mud, barbed wire, and rotting corpses stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The propaganda had promised the soldiers they would be home by Christmas, but instead, they were shivering in waterlogged trenches, facing an enemy they had been taught to hate. Yet, on Christmas Eve, something impossible happened. The guns fell silent. It began not with orders from high command, but with the simple, defiant humanity of the common soldier. Along the German lines near Ypres, small candles began to flicker on the parapets, tiny Christmas trees, or Tannenbaum, raised into the cold night air. Then came the sound of singing. The rough voices of German infantrymen drifted across the desolate no-man's land, singing the hymn Still Nacht. On the British side, the men listened in stunned disbelief before responding with their own carols. For a few hours, the exchange was musical, a duel of harmonies replacing the duel of artillery, reminding both sides that the men across the field were not faceless monsters, but fathers, sons, and Christians celebrating the same Savior. As dawn broke on Christmas Day, the truce became physical. Unarmed soldiers tentatively climbed out of their trenches, hands raised, walking into the kill zone that had claimed thousands of lives just days before. They met in the middle of no man's land, shaking hands, exchanging cigarettes, buttons, and tins of plum pudding. There are accounts of impromptu soccer games played on the frozen earth, the men kicking a ragstuff ball between piles of shell casings. It is a scene of heartbreaking beauty, men who were sworn to kill each other sharing a moment of peace, realizing that their shared culture was stronger than the political alliances that had sent them to war. The truce was not universal, and it was short-lived. Officers on both sides were terrified by this fraternization, fearing it would destroy morale and the will to fight. Snipers were ordered to fire, and the artillery barrages eventually resumed, shattering the silence and returning the world to the business of slaughter. But the legend of the Christmas truce remains the holiday's most poignant chapter, a testament to the enduring hope that peace is the natural state of humanity, and conflict the aberration. It stands as a haunting proof that even in the deepest valley of the shadow of death, the spirit of Christmas can carve out a sanctuary of light. Chapter 10: The Global Glow and the Modern Paradox. As we emerged from the wreckage of 2 world wars, Christmas entered the age of electricity, mass media, and globalization, becoming the colossus we know today. The post-war economic boom in America transformed the holiday into a commercial engine of staggering proportions, a season that could make or break the annual fortunes of entire industries. Department store windows in New York and London became theatrical stages, blurring the line between art and advertising, while the suburbs exploded in a competitive display of electric lights that made the winter night brighter than the day. The quiet candle of the Yule log was replaced by the synchronized LED display, visible from satellites orbiting the Earth, a beacon of human presence shining into the cosmos. Culturally, the 20th century added a new layer of mythology through the silver screen and the radio wave. Films like It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street codified the modern Christmas philosophy, that belief itself is a virtue, and that the holiday is a time for emotional rescue. Music, too, became a dominant force. The Christmas #1 became a cultural obsession, and songs like Bing Crosby's White Christmas, released during the height of World War II, tapped into a deep, aching nostalgia for a simpler past that perhaps never truly existed. These media artifacts created a shared global language of the holiday, exporting the snowy, Americanized version of Christmas to tropical climates and non-Christian nations alike. Today, Christmas is a global phenomenon that transcends its religious origins. In Japan, it is a romantic holiday for couples, celebrated with buckets of Kentucky Fried Chicken, a quirky tradition born from a brilliant marketing campaign in the 1970s. In the Philippines, the celebration begins in September, the longest Christmas season in the world, reflecting a deep cultural need for connection and festivity. Even in secular or multi-faith societies, the gravitation toward a midwinter festival of lights remains irresistible. It has become a carrier wave for universal values, generosity, homecoming, and the pause in the relentless forward march of time. Yet, this modern incarnation is rife with paradox. We often find ourselves exhausted by the very holiday intended to restore us, stressed by the financial burden of gift-giving and the pressure to perform the perfect family gathering. We lament the commercialization while rushing to the sales, we crave the silence of the nativity while turning up the volume of the party. And yet, beneath the plastic and the neon, the ancient heart still beats. When we gather to eat, when we travel thousands of miles to be with family, when we give a gift with no expectation of return, we are still answering the same primal call that drove the Neolithic farmers to the solstice fires. We are declaring that we are not alone in the dark. Closing summary. We have journeyed from the terrified prayers of the Stone Age to the electric dazzle of the modern metropolis. We have seen how a biological imperative to survive the winter evolved into a Roman riot, a pagan magic ritual, a theological revolution, and finally, a global celebration of kinship. Christmas is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over again and again by every generation, each adding their own fears and hopes to the story. It carries the DNA of the solstice fire, the anarchy of the Saturnalia, the solemnity of the manger, and the charity of the Victorians. It is a mirror of our history, reflecting our capacity for great violence and our potential for profound peace. It reminds us of the Roman slave who dined with his master, the Puritan who defied the law to sing a carol, and the soldier who laid down his rifle to shake the hand of his enemy. These stories are not merely dusty history, they are the living architecture of the holiday we celebrate today. They remind us that at its core, this season is a defiance of the darkness, a collective assertion that light, warmth, and love are worth preserving against the cold winds of time. As the lights twinkle on the tree and the year draws to a close, we are invited to take our place in this long, unbroken line of humanity. We are the keepers of the fire now. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you made it this far, you're the reason we keep going. Please subscribe and help us continue sharing these stories with the world.